Part of the camera journey or addiction to camera equipment is finding the right tool for the job. What works for one person might not work for someone else, and vice versa. In today's video, I'm going to talk about why I purchased the Sony A7S III. Just a quick spoiler, this is going to be a bit of a first impressions video, but I'm also going to compare it with my experience up against the Sony FX3 and what you should know if you're thinking about buying one or the other. One of the reasons I got the Sony A7S III was its form factor and EVF. First and foremost, the FX3 doesn't have an EVF, and I didn't know how much I would miss it until I got the FX3. So there's times where an EVF is invaluable. So the first reason I ended up with this camera is that beautifully clear electronic viewfinder that really is in a class of its own. Now, there's a myriad of other cameras I could have gone for, but this really ticked a lot of boxes. And anytime you're talking about shooting with multiple cameras, having the same sensor and having the same color science is a really handy thing to save on the post-production. So for those who don't know, just quickly, the Sony A7S III is the same as the Sony FX3 internally. It's basically the form factor that's different. So in a way, these two cameras are fairly identical. Welcome back, folks. This is Shane. If you're into camera reviews and tutorials, don't forget to subscribe and click the bell. I have more content coming up on the channel over the course of this year. Now, when it came to buying the Sony A7S III, I held off until the GH6 video started populating on YouTube because I thought for sure I was going to buy the GH6, but it's not for me. I'm going to talk more about that a little bit later on. I really feel like for my particular needs at this point, for the kind of work I'll be doing outside of control conditions, and also when I'm not just behind the camera, the Sony A7S III made a whole lot of sense. Now, I know a lot of Micro Four Thirds guys, Olympus, Panasonic watch this channel. I don't plan on getting rid of my GH5 Mark II. For my particular needs, that camera ticks a lot of boxes, but I did trade in two of my other cameras to sort of offset the cost of the A7S III. And again, I'll talk more about that later. Let's talk ergonomics. Now, this is a huge thing, especially if you're going to be shooting for 2 or 3 hours at a time handheld. And to me, the Sony A7S III is right up there as one of the best cameras in the hand that I've ever used, alongside the Panasonic S5. I love the feel of both of these cameras, and they're on par in terms of their button layout and their dial placement. Everything just feels very intuitive. And if you've ever shot with another brand like a Panasonic GH5 or S5, for example, you'll be right at home on the A7S III. It's taken me no time whatsoever to get used to it. I love the feel of this in the hand. While the insides of the Sony A7S III and the FX3 are the same, the external design is completely different. This camera predominantly makes you shoot more from the hip, the joystick's on the top. We get a record button on the front and on the top, as well as tally lights, and those are the things that matter most to most video shooters. While the layout is more video centric, one of the things I do miss having is a joystick on the back of the camera. And if you've been shooting with any other number of mirrorless cameras and you're very used to that, coming over to the FX3 can take you a little bit of time to get used to it. But a lot of people love it, and I love shooting with this, but I still prefer the joystick on the back. It just feels like home. One of the big reasons why I wanted this camera is its eye autofocus. Much like the FX3 and Sony A7SIII, it doesn't let you down when it comes to its eye autofocus unless you're heavily backlit. In those situations, it can struggle and then pulse, but it generally finds you again, but it's nowhere near as unreliable as other autofocus systems from different brands. After owning the Sony FX3 and A7SIII, my favorite thing, other than the image quality, is just how great this eye autofocus is, and it takes the complication out of it. Now, when I'm shooting products, I go over to manual focus every single time because I know exactly what I want in focus rather than letting the camera pick, because it'll just pick whatever the closest thing is to the screen. And if this is what you want, then it works. But sometimes if you're shooting products, that's not always ideal. Now, of course, autofocus isn't the be all and end all, and some people don't need it. If I'm behind the camera, I'm using a mix of manual focus and autofocus on other camera systems, but this is the first camera system that I personally owned where I can kind of forget about the focus unless I'm doing product shots, as I mentioned. So overall, if you're just looking to take the headache out of wondering if your shot's going to be in focus, on the most part, the Sony will get it right. Occasionally it second guesses itself, but it's so infrequent that you might not even notice it. Most people buying the A7S III or the FX3 want it for S-Cinetone and S-Log3. They're the two most popular picture profiles, but one that goes completely under the radar is no picture profile. This is the best straight out of camera colors you can get, alongside the Panasonic natural profile, which also looks really good. These are my two favorite, no picture profile and natural for Panasonic. They both give me great out of camera results without needing to do much. Sure, I can pull the highlights down or whatever the case may be in post, but I don't need to do much. And if you're in a situation where you want to be pumping out content, grading S-Log3, if you're inexperienced, can take a whole lot of time, and it is hot, I'm out of here. The Sony A7S3 has a massive advantage over the FX3 when it comes to the top dial. It allows me to hand off the camera to someone with less experience, and they can tell if they're in slow motion mode or S&Q mode or regular movie mode or in photo mode just by looking at it. On the FX3, you kind of have to dive through the digital menu, and this isn't a deal breaker by any stretch of the imagination, but you just have to make sure you know which mode you're in visibly by looking at the screen or double checking, right? So it's one of those things that you can just quickly see, okay, I'm in S&Q mode, go back to regular movie mode, and in my opinion, it has the advantage. Now, a lot of people in the comment section on my FX3 video mentioned that you can program those modes into custom buttons on the camera, but then you've sacrificed other options and custom settings that you might have already stored. So I don't see that as being really that practical. So I'm gonna give the edge in terms of just straight up usability to the Sony A7S3. When it comes to shooting slow motion, one of the great things about the Sony A7S3 is even in HD, you're gonna get far better results than Micro Four Thirds, which is essential for the kind of stuff I'm doing. And having clean slow motion in either HD or 4K is great. The 4K, man, it looks amazing. The low light performance on the Sony A7S3 is insane, and after shooting a short film on the Sony FX3, I can absolutely recommend this for anyone shooting in any lighting conditions. This camera can basically see in the dark. Now, there are some limitations to the Sony A7S3 and FX3. One, it doesn't have DCI 4K, so if you want that, you're gonna have to go to Panasonic or any other number of brands. Secondly, there's no vector scope and waveform readouts on screen, which is a huge downer if you're a filmmaker. The third thing that really drives me nuts is your left hand can sometimes get in the way of the speaker that's built into the A7S3, which means if you hit record, you can't hear it. And also if you're holding it with both hands, you can't always hear the playback unless you move your hand off the speaker. And it's right in a spot where maybe they didn't have anywhere else to put it, but it's just a pain in the ass compared with the FX3, which you can hold with both hands and still hear everything fine. So yeah, just keep those things in mind. Let's talk about the Sony Catalyst browse software and what you don't hear on a lot of other YouTube channels. And I mentioned this a long time ago when I first got the FX3, that the exporting downsamples your 10-bit files to 8-bit and also changes the color slightly as well. This is the free version. The free version does this. You need to buy and subscribe to the monthly membership to get the full benefits out of Catalyst Browse. Now, if you don't know what that is, it's a file management tool that can also post-stabilize your clips using gyroscopic data. So this means you can get gimbal-like results by using the software. The software itself is great, but just know you need the membership to get the most out of it. And if you've got lots of clips that you want to export, you need to do them individually on the free version, which takes a lot of time. And you're also going to be doubling up on your storage space because you'll have your original files and then the ones that you export that are stabilized. So all of a sudden you've got twice the amount of files. Get ready to suck up some hard drive space. One of the things I've come to love about the Sony FX3 is its really low rolling shutter, which is really surprising for a full frame camera. This is another benefit to the Sony A7S3 over something like the A7 IV. Rolling shutter is far more controlled. When I had the Sony A7 IV for about a day, I was like, oh, handheld work with this particular camera is going to be a bit of a pain due to that excessive rolling shutter, which always comes from a higher megapixel sensor. All right, one thing about Australia, once you start sweating out your sunscreen, you get cooked. So I'm gonna do the rest of the video from here in the studio. Let's talk about all the stuff I avoided at the start of the video. So the biggest reasons why I'm not gonna go for the GH6 is this. I've had a G7, a G85, a GH5, GH5S, and GH5 Mark II. At the end of the day, I really feel like the biggest step up in video quality was shifting to full frame over just replacing the Micro Four Thirds body. But there's something to be said about the GH5 Mark II. This or the original GH5 or even the G85 is a great run and gun camera. With the trappings of the autofocus aside, if you're behind the camera, you can make it work if you're using the one area mode. And this is my travel camera of choice a lot of the time, especially if in unpredictable weather conditions. This is just bulletproof. And this 12 to 35mm f2.8 zoom lens is my lens of choice. I've kept two lenses, this and the 25mm f1.7. So the results of the full frame cameras speak for themselves. And depending on the situation, I've now got a complete multi-camera setup with the S5, and anytime I'm doing something where I might be handing off a camera to my girlfriend or someone else just to hold the camera for a moment, then I can use the Sonys with confidence and know that the autofocus won't let me down. Earlier in the video, I mentioned I traded in 2 cameras for the Sony A7S3, and it helped offset the cost by 2/3, which was awesome. So I paid about 1/3 of what the retail price was for this after the 2 trade-ins, and they were my GH5S cameras. I love those cameras. The video quality is fantastic and they're lightweight, and this is what's great about Micro Four Thirds. But with no IBIS, and after owning now the S5, I didn't see any reason to hold on to them anymore. It sort of dawned on me one day, why have I still got them if everything I need is in the S5 when it comes to the Panasonic system? I'm gonna leave you with some food for thought. So find the right camera that works for your situation. Don't worry about what this YouTuber's using or that YouTuber's using, because their use case will probably be vastly different to yours unless you shoot in exactly that same style. Do your research, find out what will work best for you and what sacrifices you can make. Because if you can live without 4K 120 frames per second and the crop in 4K 60 doesn't matter that much, then of course you won't need the Sony A7S3. You can save some bucks and get a different camera. I'm gonna do a full review of this coming up, but let me know in the comments if you went for the Sony A7S3, the A7 IV, or the FX3. It's a lot of model numbers. Hopefully I've got that all right through the video because it's just a mess in there. Anyway, thanks again for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. Catch you soon. See ya.